So our future church presentation, going with the theme of the day, let us welcome Elder Rick Ufford-Chase from Stony Point Center.
Thank you, moderator. I wonder if I might ask a favor that we go back to sharing. It looks like we stopped the screen share so that I can view as many people as possible. Yes, there we are. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be with all of you this afternoon, and grateful for the technology that allows us to meet across the miles. I'm also grateful to be here and catch the tail end of the goodbyes to Mark and appreciation to him for his fine work in this presbytery. I want to start by offering something of a disclaimer, which is that I am reticent to accept any invitation to speak about almost any matter before the church right now. I'm particularly nervous about speaking about the future of the church because I think it's anybody's guess. And I don't think I have particular wisdom about that is more salient or more prescient than many of you on this call. Having said that, the one thing that I do tend to say yes to is when I'm asked, particularly by people who identify as white Christians, to speak on matters of race, which I know are issues before your presbytery, and to speak on issues around the challenges that the church faces given our history and complicity in questions of structural racism and systemic poverty. So when I received the invitation from your general presbyter and your stated clerk and your moderator to spend time with all of you this afternoon, with some trepidation, I said yes. But I don't come to this afternoon with a prepared speech that I do on a regular basis for anyone else. I am not a paid consultant. I'm not writing a lot at this point about the future of the church. I, like all of you, am in the midst of personal turmoil. Stony Point Center, where many of you know I have spent the last 12 years with my wife Kitty as co-director, has gone through wrenching change that it would have been unimaginable at this time last year. And we've laid off all 50 of our staff, including my wife and I, as of a week ago yesterday, or the day before yesterday. So I am as up in the air as everyone else is, and I offer my own reflections with humility and with the assessment or the assumption that you all will take them as offered with that humility. But having said that, I understand that the Presbytery of New York City affirmed the Matthew 25 vision. I believe it was in December of last year. And I want to speak to that text in particular without taking the time to read it. As all of you know, the 25th chapter of Matthew is significantly lengthy. But I want to just summarize this text and the meaning that I take for it in our current moment, because it's not a typical reading. And I'll just share a little bit of the history about why this text has become so important to me. I have been motivated by this text on a personal level, particularly the third pericope at the third story of the judgment of the nations and the separation of those who have seen Jesus and responded in the least of those who are all around us. That text has motivated me since I was a junior in high school. In powerful ways, it has shaped my vocation and my call to ministry over and over and over again. About 5 years ago now, in the fall of 2015, when the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship was holding its annual gathering of the Activist Council at Stony Point Center, a group of us were worried about the direction we saw the General Assembly going, that there were many overtures coming before the Assembly that year that were designed to be technocratic limitations placed on the church to, I think the impulse was genuine, that it was an effort to try and slow the divisiveness of the overall church situation. And so the goal was to try and limit the number of divisive things that we could bring up for discussion at our General Assemblies. And had those overtures been followed, there were some 15 or 20 of them, it would have dramatically reduced our social witness and our ability to speak as a people. Excuse me, I, like everyone, I'm fighting with animals in my life right now about who gets the house. So that group of us, a small group of us, met late into the night one night and came up with what we called the Matthew 25 overture. And that overture was passed almost in the exact same format that it was written on that night in September of 2015 at the following General Assembly in 2016. It was an overture that called on the church to answer all of those technocratic fixes, instead with a vision of what it would look like for our church to embrace an opposite vision, a vision in which we are clearly called to ground ourselves in justice and to be known as Presbyterians as a church that stands for and with those who are most marginalized, those who are the dispossessed, and a church that is willing to do significant self-introspection. I'm proud of the work that we did on that overture, and I'm shocked, as I think many people are, at the ways in which it has been picked up by the broader church, by the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and now by many, many presbyteries and mid-councils across the country as a banner for the vision that we are called to. And the way that it's emerged over time is that it focuses 3 commitments for the church. First, to nurture vital congregations that have the capacity to carry out the second and third items. The second being to dismantle structural racism, which is, as you all know, no small agenda, and to confront and bring an end to systemic poverty. All of those are things that are very important, but I confess that I am worried about the ways in which we are reading this text. And so I want to just share my own kind of deepening awareness and appreciation that is always changing. As recently as a few months ago, I was working this text with some colleagues and came to new insights that I've incorporated into my own thinking. That first pericope, you'll remember, is the story of the 10 bridesmaids. Then the story, to be quick and concise about it, is the story of 5 of the bridesmaids who trimmed their lamps with oil and were prepared, and 5 others who did not. They did not think ahead and did not do their work. And then they fell asleep, and when the bridegroom, who was tardy, came finally at last for the party, the 5 who were ready were welcomed into the event, and the 5 who were not were kept out. And I've always struggled with this text. For years and years, I've struggled with this text. I've struggled with it because of the ways in which I think it's been used in unhealthy ways around gender and male-female dynamics. But I've also struggled with it because of the apparent selfishness of the 5 bridesmaids who had the oil and refused to share it. And I've just never quite known what to do with it. Until some recent time ago, a colleague of mine named Bryce Wiebe from New York, from the Presbyterian Mission Agency, was working this text with a group of us and suggested, in a way that I found entirely opening for me, that perhaps we should read this text through the lens of our current moment of Black Lives Matter. And that when those 5 bridesmaids refused to share their oil, they were not being selfish. They were simply stating a fact in much the same way that people of color speak to those of us who are white. The answer being, we can't do this work for you. It is not our job to end systems of white supremacy or to help you confront the ways in which you have been enculturated into those systems of white supremacy. You are called to do that work. And when you demonstrate to us that you are doing that work, we have work to do together, but not until you're prepared to pick up that kind of a call. I don't know about you, but I find that an entirely groundbreaking way to think about that text, and it has been very important to me. The second pericope is the story that we typically call the parable of the talents, though I dislike the name and would much rather call it the story of the bold third slave. Because in that story, though many of us, including me, have been raised on the understanding of that text as an allegory for the kingdom of heaven, in fact, the language does not suggest that it's an allegory at all for the kingdom of heaven. The pericope begins with the sentence, "It is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and gathered them before him," right? So it is not the kingdom of heaven will be like, which is the way the first pericope begins. Instead, it's a description, in my judgment, and this comes directly out of my conversations that have been so impactful with me, with Latin Americans over the last 25 years. It was really, well, it was about 20 years ago that I first had this text opened to me in new ways, when Central Americans said to me, "Rick, you all are trying to take this text and you have to go through all kinds of contortions to make the master in this story come out as some kind of a benevolent God. And in fact, the master describes himself as a harsh and difficult man who gathered where he did not scatter seed. And how in the world does that mesh with the rest of who God is throughout your gospel?" This is not that at all. Rather, this is a story of a man who knew how to make so much money that he owned so much land that he could not manage it himself and had to travel. He was the effective equivalent to multinational corporations of our time. He traveled for such long periods of time that he had to entrust some of his property to his slaves. And when they were able, the first and second slaves, to double his money, they must have done it much the same way. And let's be clear about how people were able to double their money in that time. They did it by lending their money at high rates of interest that were declared in our Hebrew tradition to be entirely inappropriate, backed by people signing chits that would offer their own land, small farmers. And when they could not make the payments on their debt, those landowners would then collect on their land, and their holdings grew more and more vast over time. And so when the third slave says, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. And so I was afraid, and I took your money and hid it in the ground. And here you have what is yours." He does so knowing full well what the implications of his actions will be. And I'll just say that I've always struggled with that language, "I was afraid," because his actions do not actually strike me as someone who was afraid. He strikes me as someone who was quite courageous and quite bold. And that text was open for me a couple of years ago when I was working with a youth group from a church near Detroit. And one of the young men in the group, I'll never forget his name. His name was Ben Church. He was in 9th grade. And he said, as I worked this text, "Oh, Rick, I understand what that means. He doesn't mean he was afraid of the master. He was afraid of becoming like the master and like those other two slaves." Again, the text can be interpreted in all kinds of ways, but I find this extremely compelling. That notion that somehow we are to lift up at great personal cost our opposition and our fear of being drawn into and capitulating to systems of oppression that are designed to grind people down until there's nothing left, and instead say, "We will not participate. You do not have my consent. I will not be a part of this," knowing full well that what will result is to be cast into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that brings us to the third pericope. What is the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth? It's identifiable all around us in our world today. It's those who are systematically and intentionally shoved to the margins of our society, our economic systems, our social conditions, our sense of community with one another. It tends to be in our world, in our time, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are intentionally sidelined from any sense of full participation. And so when Jesus enters now into that third pericope and gathers all the nations, and I think the word nations is used with care, all the nations before him, and separates them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he sets the sheep at his right hand and says, "Come, O beloved of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you came to me. I was in prison and you visited me." And when they say to him, "Sir, when did we see you naked and hungry and thirsty and sick and in prison? When did we do that?" He says, I tell you, when you did it to one of the least of these, my sisters and brothers, you did it to me." Friends, I think Jesus was laying out new rules. This is the way the world works, we hear from the author of Matthew in the previous pericope, and this is the way it's going to work in the kingdom, or what Mark Lomax has called the kingdom of God, right? In our world, these people who have been pushed to the margins will be placed at the very center of our community, and all of us, at great personal cost, will do whatever is necessary to make that happen. So if it's possible for us to pull ourselves into that frame of mind, then the question, it seems to me, becomes, what is the role of church in our time? What does it mean for us to embrace a Matthew 25 vision as the Presbytery of New York City and its constituent churches and faith communities and new worshiping communities? Well, it seems to me that I can't speak, I'll just say this, I cannot speak to the individual church situations or the new worshiping communities in your presbytery. I do not know them personally, and the few that I do not know well. And I trust that there is good ministry going on in many, many of those places. But what I do think we can speak to is, what does it mean to us to associate together as a presbytery? And it seems to me that New York City Presbytery is uniquely positioned to lead the way in bold and dramatic ways on what it means to be a Matthew 25 church, to break down those systems of white supremacy, to dismantle structural racism, to stand against systems of oppression that are designed to intentionally impoverish people, and to nurture vital congregations that have the potential and the resilience and the capacity to carry that work out over time. Now, I have to say, there will be hard decisions to be made as we try to embrace that vision together. It is not, in my experience, a foregone conclusion that every congregation as it's currently constituted actually has a future. And it seems to me that there's actually a huge amount of work that must be done together, collectively, in a non-defensive posture to ask ourselves about every single one of our congregations, what is the work that we are doing? And really, at the end of the day, what are we called to, and do we have the capacity to do that work? Some of our congregations do have the capacity to do that work, to take the incredible risks that are going to be necessary in order to actually place these new rules at the center of our life together. And some of us, maybe not so much. Maybe it's time to lay down some of our congregations and to say, these congregations have served us well for a very long period of time. And now it's time to employ the resources in other ways in other locations. I don't know in your presbytery what that looks like, but I'll share a particular example in my own presbytery, and that's very close to me personally. I was a member at Stony Point Presbyterian Church for about 10 years. That congregation at its heyday back in the 1970s was, I think, nearly 300 members. There were splits and people left and it began to shrink, and they had a major split in the 1980s, I believe it was, over the ordination of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning other folks. And in the end, about half the congregation left, and they were down to quite a very low number of people when I joined the church. And there was a half-time ruling commissioner elder, I guess is the way we put that, who I thought was doing remarkable work. And all of us together were doing our level best to try and figure out how to reimagine what it might look like for this congregation to take on new life. We tried a number of things. We thought, okay, perhaps we should be leading the way on questions of gun violence and holding up vigils when the gun violence incidents, the mass shootings are taking place. And the summer that we did that, it was in the wake of the shooting that involved Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. There were so many shootings that we couldn't actually keep up. We tried for some time to imagine what it might look like to give up our Sunday morning worship. We were, in my judgment, one of 9 Reformed and Presbyterian churches left in this small county, all competing for the last 300 people who are willing to get out of bed on a Sunday morning and go to a traditional worship service. And we somehow counted a victory when we managed to get 3 people from another Presbyterian church, or even better, the Methodist church down the street, to let go of where they're going and come to our church, as if somehow we've increased the kingdom of God in the process. And so we suggested for a short time, well, perhaps what we should do is close things down and maybe begin to open ourselves up for a new kind of worship experience in the evenings, and to try and reach people who are not anywhere in particular, who do not have a faith home and who are looking for something. But in the end, I have to say, we actually were not capable of doing that work together. It was my experience that we could not let go of what had felt so comfortable for us as a congregation for so many years. We tried, following that experience about 4 or 5 years ago, to enter into a 4-church experiment where we might have 1 session, 1 church, and 4 campuses, each trying to do a different piece of the mission here in North Rockland County. But in the end, all 4 of our congregations, all of them, were too entrenched in their own identity to be able to imagine what it might look like to give up some little piece of themselves in order to affirm a common identity together. And in the end, the congregation, the session of Stony Point Presbyterian Church made a very hard decision, and I was on the session when it was made, that we should call for an administrative commission to help us to dissolve the congregation. And then something remarkable happened. Over a period of about a year, we brokered a conversation with the leadership, Chief Dwayne Perry and other leaders from the Ramapo Lenape Nation here in northern New Jersey and southern New York. And eventually, the presbytery made a decision after about a year and a half of deliberation to give the property of Stony Point Presbyterian Church, that is the church and the old Christian Ed building and a manse valued at some $1.2 million to a new nonprofit created by the Ramapo called the Sweetwater Cultural Center, with the vision that it would become the first indigenous people's mission to the United Nations on Turtle Island. So friends, I could not have imagined when we made a decision that seemed like a decision of death to close that congregation, that we might actually end up doing something that I believe actually has the potential to lead the entire Presbyterian Church in a new direction. And I would not have given up on that church if we had been able to follow the energy of any one of those possibilities before us. But here's what I'm not prepared to do, and what I believe none of us should be prepared to do. That is to continue as if somehow doing what we are doing has any possibility of delighting God. The way we have been operating for many, many years is over. And the pandemic makes that clear. And the pandemic offers possibility to us if we choose to see it as a moment in which it wrenches us out of a way that we've always been and launches us into new possibilities and new ways of thinking. I can't imagine what the 122 people who are on this call represent in terms of opportunities, but you all can in your own contexts. We have the possibility, as we embrace this Matthew 25 vision, of thinking of ourselves in new ways and imagining new possibilities, new ways of being church. That brings me to the last piece that I wanted to share, which is I am becoming increasingly radicalized in my understanding of what mission even means in a church that is built on the foundation of over 500 years of conquest and the doctrine of discovery and the history of slavery and enforcing enslaved peoples to be brought out of their homeland, to die, so many of them en route, and then systematically extracting all of their labor and their potential for generating wealth so that it accumulated wealth in other places. Friends, I go to sleep at night, many, many nights in my life, wondering if it's even possible for us as a church to do anything that could actually mitigate the unbelievable harm that we have caused to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, friends, and people who I don't know, but who are living the impacts of these decisions we have made for years. And I've come to this conclusion. I've only said this out loud once or twice before now. I'm practicing on you. Here's my conclusion. I don't think there is any kind of mission that is actually acceptable in the world as we understand it today, other than two things. One, to use our power when called upon by people at risk, whether they're immigrants in our community or people who are experiencing hate crimes and bias incidents in our communities, or people around the world who are living at the hands of death squad activity, who call on us to use our power, our unearned privilege on their behalf as accompaniers in their situation. And there are examples now, many of them that we have pulled off over these years of what good, healthy accompaniment might look like. And I lift up the example of the Columbia accompaniment program. For those of you who don't know it, you can Google it and find all kinds of information through the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship about what's going on in Colombia and also right now on the US-Mexico border. And that's one. The second is acts of reparations. Mission as acts of reparation. What would it look like if we defined our mission impulse in our own neighborhoods, in our larger communities, and around the world as entirely designed to make reparations, healing, and repair for the harm that we have caused? I don't believe there's any other way for us to approach the future than from a place of confessional repentance and a willingness to make amends for what we have done. And until we're willing to make those hard choices, we have no business in worshiping as if somehow our worship brings delight to God. Isaiah 58 makes it clear. I take no delight in your clanging cymbals and all of the things that you lift up as if this is what worship looks like. When will you put God's people, those who are most on the margins, in the center of your life together, in the center of your community? When will you stop arguing among yourselves about the things that actually don't matter to anyone outside of our little circle? When will you put God's people at the heart of the mission? My friends, that's where I am right now as I find myself without a job and at the end of a 35-year run with the Presbyterian Church nationally as a mission worker in one way or another, and trying to discern what at age 56 as a white man comfortable with the gender to which I was assigned at my birth, all of the unearned privilege that I carry, what does it look like to try and be faithful in the midst of this moment? And I look forward to those conversations because I suspect that many of you are asking similar questions. And as more and more of us ask those questions in bolder and even more bold ways, together in the context of our presbytery meetings, in the context of our synod gatherings, when we can do that work together, something magical might still happen. Bob, those are the words that I felt called to share, and I don't know where we are in our timing, but I will pause there and follow your lead about whether you'd like to engage further conversation or you all need to move on with your agenda, which I will totally understand if you do.
Madam Moderator, what's your will?
Oh gosh, I would be remiss if I even entertained the thought of stopping you, Rick. This is unprecedented, and it is my will, but I hope it's the will of the body to have you continue. If there's any objection.
Nothing else to say, Madam Moderator. I want to hear what you all want to say, or questions or comments or pushback, honestly, because the text is not to be understood in only one way, and God's impulse cannot be understood by one of us. It must be discerned together by all of us. So I've kind of said my piece, but I'm happy to engage further dialogue now or in the future. Moderator, I appreciate the other things that are pressing on all of you.
Absolutely.
There are questions in the chat, Madam Moderator.
I was going to say this might be the perfect time to utilize that Q&A button. Questions in the chat. Let's see.
It's moving up pretty fast.
Oh gosh, I can't even. It might be too fast for my Zoom to update. Would you like to read something out loud?
Madam Moderator,
Yes.
if I might suggest, because trying to read the chat as folks continue to put something in the chat makes it difficult for us to read. So I might ask people to use the Q&A and we can more easily follow the questions and get to your answers. So even if you've placed something in the chat, we'd ask, because it has scrolled several times, and I have a large screen, so it has scrolled several times for me, and so it's difficult to scroll back to read a comment. As soon as someone puts one in, it scrolls again. My eyes are killing me. So we ask that if you put a question in the chat to just now do that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. And I have been informed that unfortunately Eric Thomas also has to leave by 5. I don't know, Rick. Rick, do you also have to leave by 5?
Actually, I do. And so what I would suggest, Francis, I so appreciate our friendship, and I'll just be bold and suggest that I don't need any more time on this conversation this afternoon. I'm thinking about it all the time, and I will place my email address in the chat, and y'all are welcome to reach out to me, but I hope more what you'll do is share stories of the ways in which you're reaching out to one another. And once again, Moderator, I'm so grateful to you for the invitation to have time on the agenda. A half an hour is not an easy thing to give up for any of us right now in our lives, so thank you.
Rick, all my thanks to you. The word that you have delivered today is right in line with many of the thoughts of our Presbyterian brothers and sisters and siblings, and it was a joy to really hear you passionately declare what needs to be heard. So thank you.